Once you've created your database OpenHelper class, the next step in following the best practices for managing SQLite is to create another class called a datasource. And its methods, the datasource's methods, will be called by the rest of the app. You can create multiple data sources in an application. For example, you might create one data source for each table in a database, or one data source for each set of tasks. How you architect that is up to you. In my example, I only have a single table right now, so I'll use a single data source class. I'm working in a version of the project named datasource that already has a database OpenHelper class named ToursDB OpenHelper. And right now, its methods are being called directly by the main activity. I'll create a new datasource class, and I'll put it in the same package as the OpenHelper. I'll right-click on the .db package, and I'll create the new Java class. And I'll name this Tours Datasource. Datasource classes don't extend any particular superclass. And in fact, my datasource class won't have an explicit superclass at all. I'll click Finish, and that creates the class structure. The first step in creating the datasource class is to create a public constructor method. I'll move the cursor inside the class declaration, and I'll type in public, then the name of the class, and the constructor method will receive a single argument, the context of the current activity. I'll type the name of the context class and press Control Space and import it, and I'll name the argument context. So that's the only constructor method that the datasource class will have. In order to instantiate this class, the activity must pass in the context. Next, I'll declare the instances of the database OpenHelper and the database. Right now, I've done this in the main activity class, so I'll go steal that code from the activity and bring it into the data source. I'll go to the main activity class. I'll expand this to full screen to make it a little bit easier to read. And here are the two declarations I need, one for the OpenHelper and one for the database. I'll copy those to the clipboard. I'll come back to the data source class, and I'll paste them inside the class declaration, but outside of any methods. And Eclipse automatically adds the required imports. I'll instantiate the database OpenHelper class when the data source is instantiated. So I'll add code to the Tours data source constructor method. Once again, I have code that will do this. I'll go back to the main activity and scroll down toward the bottom of the onCreate method. And I'll take these two lines of code that are instantiating the OpenHelper and the database. I'll copy those to the clipboard. I'll come back to the data source, and then I'll place the cursor inside the constructor method and paste that code into place. I need to make one change. When I instantiated the OpenHelper from the activity, I passed in this as the context. This refers to the data source, not the activity, but I'm receiving the activity context right here. So I'll just take that context argument and pass it into the OpenHelper's constructor. In a way, that's all I really need to do, but I'm going to make this code even easier to use by adding another couple of methods called open and close. They'll be public methods, and the idea will be that any activity in my application can open or close the database connection anytime it wants to. So I'll create two new methods. First, I'll create a method called open. It'll return void. And then I'll take that bit of code and duplicate it. And for the second version, I'll name it close. Whenever each of these methods are called, I'm going to want to log them in the logcat console. So I'm going to set up a constant that I can use as my logcat tag. Once again, I'll get that from the main activity class. I'll go to the main activity to the top of the class, and I'll copy the log tag constant. Then I'll come back to the data source and paste it into place. Then I'll go to the open method. I'll type in the name of the log class, and I'll add an import. Then I'll call the .i method for info. I'll pass in the log tag argument, and then a message of database opened. And then I'll repeat that for the close method. I'll duplicate that line of code, move it into place, and change the message to database closed. I'll add code to actually open and close the database. The code I need to open the database is already here. It's actually in the constructor method. When you call the getWritable method, that opens the database connection. So I'm just going to take this line of code and move it into the open method. I'll hold down my Option key on Mac or the Alt key on Windows, and then press the down arrow and move the code into place. And then for the close method, I'll call the OpenHelpers close method. So now I have all the pieces I need for a basic data source class. I have a constructor method that instantiates my OpenHelper, and I have code to open and close the database connection. Now I'll modify my main activity. The main activity is no longer going to deal directly with the database OpenHelper or the database. That will all be hidden inside the data source object. So I'll delete these two declarations. And I'll replace them with a declaration of an instance of Tours data source, my new data source class. I'll name it data source, and I won't instantiate it yet. I'll wait till I get to the onCreate method. Now I'll go down to the onCreate method, and once again I'll get rid of the code that's dealing directly with the database OpenHelper and the database, and I'll replace it with instantiating the data source. And I'll pass in this as the context. Finally, if you want to maintain a persistent database connection for the entire lifetime of the activity, you can add code to the methods onPause and onResume. These are methods that are automatically called by Android during the life cycle of the activity. As the activity comes to the screen, its onResume method is called. So I'll go down to the bottom of the activity code. I'll place the cursor after any of the existing methods, and I'll type in onResume. I'll press Control Space and choose the onResume method. I'll get rid of the comment, and then after the call to the superclass's onResume method, I'll call datasource.open. Similarly, you should explicitly close the data source connection whenever the activity pauses. The onPause method is called as the activity closes down. So I'll type in onPause, I'll press Control Space, and I'll choose the onPause method that creates the override. And after the call to the superclasses method, I'll call datasource.close. And now we're ready to test the whole thing. Remember, my data source is outputting to the logcat console whenever its open and close methods are called, so I'll easily be able to track when these operations are happening. I'll go to my logcat console, and you can clear any existing output by clicking on the Clear Log button. Then I'll run the application in the emulator. As the application comes to the screen, the onPause method is called automatically as a part of the activity lifecycle, and I see the message Database Opened. I'll leave the activity by clicking the Back button. I'm going to move the emulator out of the way so we can see these messages, and I see the message Database Closed. I'll go to my application list, and I'll reopen the application, and once again the activity opens and the database opens. And I'll click the Back button, and the database closes. Every activity in your application can open and close the database connection as needed. It's also useful to know that you can add as many calls to the open method as you want to. The connection object within any activity is cached, and so you don't have to worry about calling the open method too many times. But you should make sure that you're explicitly closing the connection whenever the activity is going away. That will eliminate the possibility of what are known as database connection leaks. A database connection leak can cause memory and performance issues. So by adding the code to explicitly open and close the database when needed, will make your application work well, work fast, and give you a reliable way to work with structured data.